thank you, first of all, for the generosity to give me this prize, which I understand is a prize, in my case, for economic research. Last night, the laureates met with people from the institute and from the city, and the discussions there centered really on the issue, what are the consequences for economic welfare of robotization and of globalization? And I think we could say that everybody agreed that both these processes are potentially very positive for social welfare in society. But many people have been left behind in both processes by losing jobs and losing income and losing orientation in life. And I think this is partly the consequences of the blindness of established political parties who did not respond to protests on the environmental side and on the globalization side, on the migration side. And that meant that new political parties were necessary. Entry in the political market emerged when the standard parties did not take up the issue. Unfortunately, the established parties then just tried to stigmatize all new parties who try to deal with the issues and make them martyrs in many countries. And this way, paradoxically perhaps, helped them to be established in society, because many people felt that many individuals have been left behind and the political parties have been passive, and the entrant parties were really treated very badly. We should not call people who are uncomfortable from what is happening in the economy as foreign enemies or something like that. They have a case, and we should listen to them. I was awarded this prize for research and not for policy advising, as I understand it. And this means that it may be proper that I talk about economic research in this case. And more specifically, I've been going to deal with rather within research society issues, or more specifically, what has really economics analysis contributed to? In which way have it contributed to our understanding of what happens in the economic systems? And what are the limitations and weaknesses of economic research as it is conducted today? Is it really possible to make solid economic research on economic issues? I have often been asked this question by people in the natural sciences, and I've usually said, yes, it's possible, but it's not as easy as in natural sciences. And this is an answer rather than just a joke. What I mean is, of course, that economic systems are extremely complex systems and therefore difficult to analyze. Moreover, they change over time and they differ geographically in the world. So let me therefore discuss, first of all, what would I say is the main contribution of economics to understanding the functioning of the economy. Well, first of all, doubts about the usefulness of economics among some people is based on a misunderstanding to some extent of what we deal with. They interpret to a large extent economics research as forecasting the future development of the economy. But forecasting and research are two completely different things. Research tries to scrutinize and analyze the mechanisms by which the economy developed. Forecasting, you can only forecast if you, in addition, guess what exogenous events will happen in the future, such as the weather, technological development, preference changes, and not least government decisions. And that's why I want to emphasize that we study mechanism. And one very important aspect then is that the consequences of exogenous events and government policies do not only have direct effects, they have indirect effects which are much more difficult to see and are therefore neglected in the political discussion. Let me take a simple example. Some countries have introduced rent control, and it's very easy to see what the direct effect is. It's lower rents for individuals with first-hand contracts on tenement apartments. But the indirect effects are not seen to the same extent. You get excess demand for housing, that is housing shortage, you get queues, you get black markets, you get long waiting times to get an apartment. In Sweden, we have now had rent control for 75 years. And today it takes 12 years to wait in a queue to get an apartment in Stockholm. It's about the same length of time as people have to wait for a Trabant car in Eastern Europe a number of years ago. Moreover, how do you get an apartment when you have to wait, if you cannot wait 12 years? You have to buy it in the black market, you have to buy a condominium, and you have to buy a residential home. And who can do that? That's people who have high wealth. So we have created rent control has created a system where the consumption of housing depends on your wealth or your parents' wealth to a considerable extent. These indirect effects have never been discovered by people who take decisions in the field. So that is my answer to that economic analysis, in particular partial and general equilibrium analysis, studies indirect effects by studying the complex interaction between different consequences and different changes in variables in the economic system. Now, even if this is a very important contribution made during the generations of brilliant economists, economics, like all social sciences, are confronted with serious limitation. One example is how to deal with the relation between formal modeling and intuitive reasoning. It's probably generally agreed that it's important that formal analysis and common sense reasoning should be combined. Paul Samuelson had a very good formulation of this issue once. He said, all economic regularities that have no common sense core that you can explain to your wife will soon fall. I tend to agree. Intuition is important, But there are also dangers of intuitions and limitations. One is that intuition is very fragile. This is illustrated by the fact that it's very easy to give a verbal, intuitive explanation afterwards when you have first seen the formal analysis. And this means that intuition is very fragile because it's too flexible. Let me take an extreme example. Suppose that an economist, by a formal model, used theory and statistics, he found out that the parameter alpha has negative effects on variable x. But after a year, and he has then he gets a very good intuition why we should expect exactly that. But after half a year, he found an error in the calculations. So the sign was really the opposite one. After a few weeks, he had a new intuition for the reverse effect than he defended and explained earlier. It reminds me of Groucho Marx. He said once, I have very strong principles, but if you don't like my principles, I have a new one. So intuition has a similar problem as strong principles that are adjusted. Another problem is that we have priors. Before we make an analysis, we expect to find some systematic mechanism in the economic system. But sometimes people get results that are against their own priors. And what many people do then is to rethink. Is it something wrong with the theory behind it? Have we used bad data, or have we used the wrong statistical techniques? And after massaging the model sufficiently, they are able to get conclusions that fit with the priors. Of course, it is equally important to try to scrutinize the results afterwards when you get results that fits your priors. But incentives to look into those possibilities is much weaker. So that creates a bias. You start to rethink the analysis when you get results that you do not expect. But you are not as eager to start to recalculate everything if you get results that are in conformity with the priors. This issue is dealt with to some extent nowadays, because in the journals with the referees, they always point out that you have to make robustness checks on the results. Do the results change if you change the assumptions or methods or the data marginally? So that's a healthy reaction to this bias that could occur otherwise. There are also other problems which economics share with other social sciences. If you have used a model for many years, or you have invested 10 or 20 years to learn to master it, you have a tendency to try to apply it to every problem in the world, even if it does not fix. You might then run into the situation that Daniel Kahneman called theory-induced blindness. That you could say that a model functions as a flashlight on a theater stage. What you lit up comes out much clearer, but the rest becomes even more difficult to see. So that is a case for looking at robustness by varying the assumptions and by looking at a wider economic and social environment in which the system operates. Now, some criticism of economics is specific for our research area. And I would like to mention two such criticisms in particular. One is that we are criticized for excessive interest in individuals who have very good intellectual capacity, that they were completely rational individuals. And research has shown in many cases that the rationality is often much smaller than in models. And another criticism is that you cannot make justice to the complexity of our society by using so narrow motives, assuming so narrow motives for individual behavior, namely selfishness. And as a consequence, it has been more and more important nowadays that economic models include elements of non-rational behavior, over-optimism, etc. And also the individual motives are wider nowadays than in research 10 or 20 years ago. You have much more social norms and similar mechanisms, status, etc. Social variables that were for a long time absent from economic analysis. In spite of this improvement in recent years, many critical comments still exist. What has happened is that economic models have, in recent periods, imported knowledge from other social sciences, in particular in social psychology. And there is no doubt that the realism have been increased in many cases when the assumptions about the motives of individual behaviors are richer than in traditional analysis. However, even if there is large advances in economic analysis in recent years, we have to admit that the precision will never achieve the same level as in physics. Indeed, John Stuart Mill, long time ago, emphasized that asserted economic mechanisms are really statements about tendencies rather than tight laws. In a similar way, Friedrich von Hayek has argued that economic analysis only achieve what he called pattern prediction, which I interpreted as broad, mainly qualitative knowledge about economic mechanisms, without precision in quantitative analysis. But I am, however, somewhat more optimistic than John Stuart Mill and Hayek, and that's because there has been so great progress in recent years. great progress in recent years, in particular in quantitative economic analysis, that is econometrics, where the methods help us to see the difference between simple correlations and causality, which is a very important contribution. So I think there is great hope that progress will continue and many limitations will be eliminated in the coming years. Those who live can wait and see. Thank you.